afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Let's start with this session with a little bit of a backstory. So, once upon a time, a young man, a few weeks from finishing up grad school, was captivated by this job ad in the local newspaper. And it promised teamwork in the headline and imagery of a crew team rowing in tandem. And it awoke something in that young man. Yes, that person was me. That young man was me. And this was a job ad that brought me to work at Sapient back in 1995. And in case you're wondering, the BG here stands for before Google. So I joined Sapient as a C++ developer, and my first assignment was a pretty confidential project to build a CRM and call center application for what was then our largest financial services client. And this picture here was with a few of my teammates. I'm on the left with that silly grin, and Madhu is next to me. He led the profile and the interaction module. He looks dead serious about winning the paintball game that we were playing here. And Doug Moore, our project architect, is standing right next to him. And he's smiling, but you can tell he's a little bit tentative about whether Madhu should have that weapon or not. So our work on this team was pretty challenging. For me personally, besides writing the four distributed database drivers we were using DEA Tuxedo, I was doing the computer telephony integration as well as the ad hoc reporting module. I also was given the task of the Oracle DBA and Solaris sysadmin on the dev environments. So it was a little bit of DevOps trial by fire, but we shipped on time and we launched an application that was widely adopted. And we had tremendous fun as a team. My smile here is pretty genuine. We did some great work. We had fun doing it. And the reason why you should care about my SAPI story simply is this number, 15038. So if you're wondering what this is, yesterday I asked Tilak what the median age of our engineering community was. So he was silent for a couple of minutes. I'm guessing that he fired up his Azure Data Factory. He wrote a data flow to ingest and cleanse our people data, configure and harden the pipeline, fired off a query, did a sanity check, and then he just says 32, and he hung up. So yes, the median age of our PS engineering population globally is 32. So if you look at Wikipedia, I saw that the global life expectancy is 73.2 years. That yields 15,032 days left in the bank. Now, without any intention of being morbid, it's worth reflecting that this is the only counter that we cannot replenish, right? So for you and me and everybody at this conference, time is our most precious commodity. We are given this budget. It's our responsibility to make the most out of it. Further, we spend most of our working lives on teams. So how do we make the most impact and live a life of joy at work? So many people have obsessed over this question. In fact, 20 years ago, this very day, the Agile Manifesto was born. One of the reasons Sapient was so successful as a young company in the 90s is we had developed a highly effective alternative approach to software. So the dominant paradigm at the time was documentation-driven, heavyweight software development processes. Instead, we brought clients into our design centers. We built progressive prototypes right in front of their eyes. We involved real end users in software production, right? On that first CRM project, I did daily stand-ups, weekly team retrospectives that were led by Doug and Larry on our full team. System demos were no more than 4 weeks apart, and this was all back in 95. And that was obviously way before Feb 12, 2001, when 17 people who were kind of anti-waterfall software methodology rebels, sometimes competitors, they met at this lodge in Utah to talk, to ski, to relax, and to try to find some common ground. As we at Sapient had already discovered, there was a better way to develop software than documentation and waterfall. And on this day, history was made. What emerged from that lodge was this Agile Software Development Manifesto. As some like to tell the story, right, Agile was a rejection of waterfall, the old paradigm that Winston Royce had invented in 1970. Royce had come up with waterfall really to mimic how real engineers built buildings. Waterfall said that you should do everything in a strict order, right? Only progressing to the next stage of development when the current stage is completed. You only develop after you complete design. You only test after you finish development. The problem was this utterly failed when the requirements kept changing, and often the customer didn't know what they wanted and before you got to build it, right? And this paradigm was what was rejected by the Agile Manifesto back 20 years ago. So the Utah meeting also came out with this list of 12 principles. Now, if you look at those principles, a good number of them shifted the focus from process and stage gates to a rigorous emphasis on people. Now, this emphasis on people is no surprise. Alistair Cockburn, one of the 17, right, of the manifesto authors in that group, he was a keen observer of software practices in the world. He'd written a paper, in fact, which was called Characterizing People as Nonlinear First-Order Components in Software Development. Now, in stark contrast to CMM and other schools of process thought, Alistair said he now considered process factors to be second-order issues. He found that it was largely people who make projects succeed or fail, and he suggested that we focus our improvement efforts on harnessing the unique attributes of people. Wow, what a great idea, right? Music to my ears, I'm sure music to your ears. So how do we get the most from people, from you and me? Now, every Agile variant, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or scaling approaches like Scaled Agile, has extensive guidance on how teams should collaborate. Yet one of the common complaints I hear from teams moving to an Agile approach are the number of meetings they must now attend, right? Planning sessions, daily stand-ups, sprint reviews, retrospectives, product backlog grooming. You find these populating the calendar and you wonder when you'll actually have time to work. That's just for Scrum. If you're on a team of team constructs with SAFe, you also have the solution demo, PI planning, pre-PI planning, post-PI planning, system demo, inspect and adapt, art sync, the Scrum of Scrums, PO sync. So you might be wondering, have Agile rituals taken us from process rigor to meeting hell? Now, if you don't understand what these are and what they are intended to really achieve and how to get the most personal value out of them, it's certainly easy to feel like they are taking a dent out of your budget of $15,032, right? So I want to share with you a new perspective on how to think about these rituals and get the most from them. And to do that, let's examine the problem by examining the history of work. So I talked about Winston Royce, right, the creator of Waterfall. Now, long before Royce came along and coined Waterfall, we had this dude. He was a machinist and mechanical engineer by trade. So Frederick Winslow Taylor, he led a professional crusade against waste and inefficiency. He became one of the first management consultants in the process, right? At the heart of the waste in Taylor's mind was the wide variation in how work was performed from one worker to the next. So he said it would be much better for everyone to be taught the one right way and then for workers to follow that one right way. Now, professional management consultants such as Taylor himself were the creators of that one right way. So scientific management, the philosophy with which Taylor was the most vocal proponent of, says that it's the job of managers to devise and understand the best way of working and then enforce total unswerving standardization. So he wrote a book in 1911 called The Principles of Scientific Management, and he provided the intellectual underpinning for mass manufacturing based upon the assembly line, right? Low-skilled workers doing the same simple task. So his view of the world created a very distinctive and dehumanizing workplace culture. The factory was envisioned as one giant machine. Managers were the mechanical engineers designing how all the pieces should work together and checking that they were operating correctly. Workers were merely replaceable parts, right? They operated within specified tolerances, and if they were defective, they had to be discarded. Communication was top-down and limited to commands and corrections. Conversations were not required, especially between workers. Collaboration was not required. Thought was not required beyond doing the job you had been told to do. And I realize I'm being very, very disparaging here, but it really is part of the Taylor philosophy. Now, the struggle between Waterfall and the Utah group was really a struggle between two views that on the surface here are presented as completely opposing. Either process wins or people win. We like to think of problems in simple win-lose terms, right? Tug of war. But the world is seldom that simple. And And so we must dig deeper and really examine work from first principles, work itself. Let's dive into work and have some fun with it. So imagine I have an item of work. It can be any work. You can imagine the work of creating a single module or a class. It doesn't matter, but it's helpful to have some tangible work in your mind as I walk through this. The length of this segment represents how long it will take to execute the work. Now let's add a worker. And it will take this single worker this long to finish the work, right? So, okay, this is a very simple example. Now let's divide this work into 4 segments. And it will still take the worker, one worker, the same amount of time to accomplish the work. So if we want to go faster, one thing we can do is to divide the work. And so now with 4 workers, we can complete the work in 1/4 of the time, right? It's a very straightforward model. There's no surprises here. So what this graph depicts is the concept of linear scalability, right? The more workers we have, the faster we can accomplish the work. So the function we have here, x of n, is throughput given n workers. Gamma, or the efficiency multiplier in this case, is equal to 1. So we have 5 workers give us 5 throughput, 10 workers give us 10 throughput, right? Now our model is missing an aspect of what it actually takes to do work in the real world. So the extra green segments here represent the additional time required for distributing and integrating these work segments. Our first worker here at the top has to hand out the work to the other workers, and then they have to assemble that work back together. So you can think of this as contention or queuing or waiting for a resource. Notice that this distribution integration, it adds some time to accomplish the work. And this line is a little bit longer than the quarter line that we had before, right? So accounting for this contention or queuing or waiting aspect of the system, this, what you see here, is Amdahl's law. We added to the denominator of the equation the component that represents contention or alpha, and it's the fraction of the work that cannot be parallelized, right? So that's the first worker distributing the work and then bringing it back together. So that's the piece that cannot be parallelized, and even with 1% of the work being serialized in this manner, we start seeing the diminished throughput on the graph. It's that gray line that you see over there, right? As you're increasing the amount of work to distribute and reassemble, you get a certain degradation. But waiting and queuing is not the only thing that impacts our ability to accomplish work. What happens when the workers need to start coordinating and talking with each other? Each worker now makes the other workers do extra work through the discoordination overhead. And this is pretty bad. It's O(n) squared bad, right? Order n squared. On the right here is a visual example of O(n) squared growth, right? This is the nature of coherence. We face this problem with any kind of distributed system. It's the delay for data to become consistent or coherent by virtue of point-to-point exchange of data between resources that are distributed. I learned this problem very acutely when we were trying to scale the target. We had an Oracle rack system over there where we had 5 nodes that were spending more time talking to each other than they were to the application. And that was one of the reasons the system was unstable during Black Friday loads. It's the same problem, right? It's all about point-to-point communication between workers. So we can see how much coordination we need to do with 2 workers, with 5 workers here, with 12 workers. So accounting for the coherence aspect of the system, we end up with this law that Neil Gunther first proposed, and it's called the Universal Scalability Law. So once again, we added to the denominator, right? The beta n into n minus 1. And beta represents the percentage of work due to this crosstalk and coordination on top of the contention that we've done previously, right? So with beta set to as low as 1%, we already see the point of diminishing returns. So that's the red line on that chart. And this shows at this point 1% contention and 1% coordination. Now, 10 workers is the point after which we get diminishing returns in this scenario, right? Now, remember I said 1%. For context, 5 minutes of an 8-hour workday is 1%. So if you're wondering, oh, yum, if you're wondering where the concept of a two-pizza team came from, the Universal Scalability Law has the answer. The range of a two-pizza team is 7 plus or minus 5, and this is kind of where it falls on this Universal Scalability Law graph. I must point out that the lower end is when I'm eating pizza because I want a whole pan to myself, but I digress. So why does this matter, right? The main takeaway is that coordination between team members kills throughput. And it's not a lot of coordination, just a tiny little bit kills throughput. It turns out that the Universal Scalability Law has profound implications on how we design work. So the first implication, if requirements are stable, if we have an expert who can make a correct and detailed work plan in advance, this is actually a superior way of scaling teams for that sort of problem. The teams can be much larger before we lose efficiency. This is simply because of the loss due to contention or alpha, and the denominator is of order n. We do see some loss, but the math shows us that we can keep getting more work by adding more workers, even with a high number of workers. So teams in this mode of working can be quite large. This was actually the type of problem that Taylor was solving for. And for that type of problem, Taylor's solution of specifying every step of the work is actually mathematically superior. Unfortunately, right, most real problems we face today are not of that nature. Shopper behaviors are changing faster than ever. The nature of competition and the fact that customers are in charge means that not only do requirements change all the time, but we also require many people collaborating on a team to even design solutions. So the nature of transformation work requires this crosstalk between team members. And that means that we have to deal with the beta coefficient. The math then suggests two things. One, we've already talked about, right? It's keep teams small, or the two-pizza rule. And the second, do everything we can to reduce beta. In other words, to make the interactions between team members more efficient. So up until this point, I've just glossed over gamma, right? I kind of flippantly told you, like I set this numerator to 1. It turns out that gamma is the individual efficiency multiplier. The reason this is important is that people have trouble acting consistently over time. You and I are highly variable. We vary from day to day and from place to place. But for the most part, if we create the right conditions, we generally want to be good citizens, right? We're good at looking around, taking initiative, doing whatever is needed to get work done. And this was one of the flaws with Taylor's thinking, right? But it is an important factor for us to have that. So this, in fact, coming full circle back to where I started with Agile and Agile rituals, this is, in fact, exactly what Agile rituals are designed to do, right? Agile rituals are intended to reduce beta, to foster collaboration, reflection, improvement, to keep that beta and the crosstalk penalty down, and to keep individual happiness high by creating a safe, appreciative, and generative environment. For example, regardless of how the previous sprint went, a new sprint planning session allows a team and each individual to focus on what lies ahead with a clean slate, right? It also ensures that everybody can then get to focused work without interrupting each other with unplanned dependencies within the sprint. The retrospective allows us to learn and grow from our past experiences in the healthy and supporting environment of a team with shared purpose. Now, if your Agile rituals are not doing the job of reducing beta, crosstalk, and maximizing gamma or individual productivity and happiness, then we must address that. You and your team must address that. See, mostly the problem lies in rituals that have degraded to routine. There's a huge difference between a routine and a ritual. A routine is getting up every morning, eating breakfast, brushing your teeth, taking a shower, getting dressed, going to work, right? It's not a meaningful part of our day, at least not for most, but it needs to get done, so we do it, right? It's viewed as a chore. Rituals are more meaningful practices. There's symbolism involved, a real sense of purpose. A big part of it is subjective, your subjective, my subjective experience. So if you find yourself really feeling like your Agile rituals are a waste of time, then look within yourself. Are you on the left of this chart or on the right? Why? What can you do about it? Some of us may associate rituals with religion or spirituality, but I offer that we can transform any routine into a ritual with the right attitude and perspective. For example, one very simple thing you can do is recite affirmations. So you look at the retrospective prime directive here. Set at the beginning of every retrospective with real seriousness and emphasis. Regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. The act of reciting this, instead of feeling like every Agile activity is something that just needs to get done, it becomes an activity you feel serves a positive function in your life. It becomes something you may even enjoy doing and look forward to. Ultimately, the more meaning you can add to your Agile rituals, the more motivated you become to do them, right? So trying to take a step back and see the bigger picture behind Agile rituals, how they improve your team beta and your life gamma. Because ultimately, this is what we have, 15 and 38. Steve Jobs, he once famously said, everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you, and you can change it. You can influence it. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. So let's spark joy on our teams and make the biggest impact on the universe by helping people thrive in the brave pursuit of next. And let's do that together. Thanks for listening. Open to questions.
Very powerful, Sheldon, I must say. And I think the chat box is quite alive with similar feelings. People saw more mathematical symbols in in an Agile segment than in all the AI and ML and all other sessions that we had. So open for questions, everyone. We have Sheldon with us.
I see some comments around the Universal Scalability Law. It's a fascinating equation, so simple, and it can be applied to any systems in which we are trying to scale with horizontal scalability. So as I said, this was the same thing around that we learned on Target. It was just the workers talking to each other is a huge problem. In terms of database scalability, it's a core issue. Tilak saying, I wonder if Bezos knew this. Exactly. Bezos has designed, Tilak, the Amazon organization for exactly that, right? The whole reason of independent teams operating solely with APIs is all about ensuring that he moves everything from beta to basically just queuing overhead, right? So he's managing that denominator really well from an organizational standpoint. And it's one of the reasons that our clients struggle is because they actually have systems and organizations that are pretty tightly coupled. So they need to talk to each other, and that causes this beta overhead.
So Sheldon, that was a great talk. I just loved the rituals versus routine slide. This is Rakesh, by the way. I have one question for you, right? So you must have read that case study about pilots and doctors. They do a set of steps almost passively, right? Like doing the flight check before the takeoff or before an operation. They just do a set of steps of scrubbing their hands and putting on the gowns. Those are all routines, right? They are not rituals, right? Because sometimes there is no meaning into it. But sometimes routines are important. You need to do those routines so that you don't miss anything, right? So how does that fit in when you sort of talked in this routines versus rituals?
It's a fantastic question, Rakesh. See, I will relate to it in the same way as I relate to brushing my teeth, right? The interactions I have with myself, where I'm following a checklist because I need to basically ensure that I have a habit to do something. It isn't a very high cognitive function where I need to put myself wholly into making a productive connection with somebody else. When I think about Agile rituals, it's all about reducing this coordination overhead. And what does that mean? It means connecting with another human being, every other human being on my team, and ensuring that interaction, I am fully present in it. I'm giving it my everything because that's what reduces beta. It's what makes that interaction worthwhile. We can't make those interactions passive. We've got to reflect on them. We've got to figure out how to make them most effective, because if we don't do that, we won't hear each other, and we won't actually make sure that when we are hearing each other, we are fully engaging and also doing that efficiently. That's the way I think about it, quite simply. And I think that personal tasks can be made routine, and I think that collaborative tasks have to be made, completely engaging. And rituals, in my mind, especially agile rituals, are all about really making it engaging.
Yeah, I think that is, I agree with you, right? Like, I think the distinction between personal and when someone else is involved, I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, great insight, Rakesh.
One question on the Q&A box, Sheldon. What's your thought on preference between perfection or moving fast and break things?
It's an involved answer, and I know I'm already over time here. See, I think the question comes down to, like, in the real world, the ability to observe the environment, to analyze what's going on, to quickly react and put something else in terms of stimulus into the world. So basically, test and learn is critical. This has to be done both with the right mix of thought and penchant for action. Right? We have to learn from our past in order to shape the future. That's one thing, but also the willingness to move fast and move aggressively comes down to really understanding the consequences of what we are doing. So is it a one-way door or two-way door? If we feel like, we can put something out there, and if it doesn't work, we can quickly reverse it out, that's a perfect thing to put into a model where we move fast and break things. If, on the other hand, the consequences of doing so are actually quite high, we need to think about that slightly differently. We need to minimize the zone of impact, still test and learn, but actually minimize the zone of impact. And we can have many discussions around specific scenarios of how that applies to our work, but that's the top level of how I think about it. So I know we are at time. I don't want to keep the group any longer, but thank you so much for having me and for listening.
This was wonderful, Sheldon. Thank you for your time today.